J'ouvre maintenant la séance.
I now call the meeting to order. Welcome to the 21st meeting of the Standing Subcommittee on International Human Rights of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Pursuant to the motion adopted by the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development on Tuesday, September 23, 2025, and the motion adopted by the Subcommittee on Monday, May 25, 2026, the Subcommittee will meet for a briefing on the situation of Tibetan children placed in schools administered by the People's Republic of China. Today's meeting is being held in a hybrid format in accordance with the rules of procedure. Members may participate in person or through the Zoom app.
Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. For those on Zoom, at the bottom of your screen, you can select the appropriate channel for interpretation, floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. J'aimerais maintenant souhaiter.
I would now like to welcome our witnesses.
As an individual, Shemi Lamo, Tibetan Canadian human rights activist from International Campaign for Tibet, Washington, Tekno Gyatso, President by video conference, from Tibet Action Institute, Dr. Gyal Lo, Tibet specialist and educational sociologist, and Loden Tetong, co-founder and director. From Tibet Watch, Tenzin Choekiai, senior researcher by video conference. Welcome to you all. Every one of you will have 5 minutes for introduction. Yes.
Oui, Monsieur le Président, deux choses.
Mr. Chair, two things. Is the time okay because the voting took some more time than expected? Do we have all the time that we need? And secondly, Ms. Lamo will have to speak last, I think, among the witnesses and not first. Thank you.
Madame or Monsieur Gyatso, President, I would like to start with Mr. Gyatso, President. Madame, sorry, I have a little bit confusion with the name. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, Vice Chairs, and esteemed committee members, I would like to begin by recognizing the leadership already shown by the Canadian Parliament and this committee in particular on the Tibetan cause. Thank you for using your voice to stand with the Dalai Lama, with Tibet, and with Tibet's children. Thank you also for inviting me to speak on the alarming situation of Tibetan children placed in boarding schools and preschool institutions administered by the PRC government. Both Canada and the United States have called for sanctions against Chinese officials responsible for the boarding school system in Tibet. Germany and numerous other governments and parliaments have also called for an end to this forced assimilation of Tibetan children. The UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights called for an end to the boarding schools in its third periodic review of China. But China continues to accelerate its efforts. On July 1, just days before His Holiness the Dalai Lama's 91st birthday, Beijing will bring into force the so-called Ethnic Unity and Progress Law. This new law makes the state's ambitions unmistakably clear, laying a stark blueprint for the erasure of Tibetan language, culture, and identity. Several provisions in this outrageous law are deeply concerning. Article 15 says the state shall promote written and spoken Chinese, and even if a non-Chinese language is to be used, the state should give priority to the national standard spoken, written, and Chinese language and script. Thus, Tibetan is placed in a subordinate position. The law permits cultural expression only when it serves party ideology. It pushes faith, speech, and identity to the margins whenever they diverge from the state's approved narrative. These measures arrive at a moment when Beijing is coercing nearly 1 million Tibetan children, roughly 4 out of every 5 Tibetan children between the ages of 6 and 18 into state-run boarding schools. For Tibetan children, childhood is spent not in the company of parents and grandparents, but in institutions designed to reshape how they speak, what they believe, and ultimately who they are. Recently released images by the United Front Work Department from southern Tibetan town of Tsona, close to the Indian border, reveal some disturbing scenes of indoctrination. Tibetan kindergarten children, likely under the age of 6 years old, dressed in military camouflage uniforms, marching under the Chinese flag, and participating in a simulated combat exercises. These children appear to be carrying imitation rifles as part of what is described as national defense and ethnic unity themed educational activities. These state-run boarding schools are part of a much broader system that has also swept hundreds of thousands of adults into what UN experts have described as large-scale coercive labor programs. This system exists within a wider framework of fear and intimidation characterized by severe restrictions on freedom of expression, religion, movement, cultural practice. I also find it deeply alarming that Tibetan children are barred from monasteries and other places of worship. Even traditional festivals and religious observations are curtailed. And this new law's reach extends even beyond China's borders, creating a legal framework through which criticism that is voiced in Ottawa, in Washington, D.C., or Geneva, or any other place could be portrayed as and punished for undermining ethnic unity.
Please try to finish a few more seconds on.
All right. On July 1st, this framework enters into force. On this, I want to context His Holiness the Dalai Lama says Tibetan culture has much to contribute to the benefit of humanity. And this Dalai Lama is the embodiment of this culture. He works tirelessly championing a framework for teaching compassion, ethical discernment, and inner resilience. He calls it inner disarmament. He says world peace must come from
Thank
inner
you, thank you. We exceed 20 minutes, 20 seconds. Sorry.
All right.
I appeal every one of you to respect the time because we are short in time, please. And now I would like to invite Dr. Gyal Lu to take the floor for 5 minutes, please. Or Ladon Tetong, any one of you, please.
Thank you, Chair. Almost 5 years ago, we released our first report on residential boarding schools in Tibet, showing that schooling in Tibet today is mostly residential. With approximately 1 million Tibetan children, at least 78% of students living separated from their parents and families in the state-run boarding system. But what we didn't know with any certainty, due to China's near total information blackout on Tibet, was the actual conditions in the schools. Sadly, our second report reveals new evidence of children facing serious abuse and neglect. Loss of language to the extent that one person describes Tibetan children in his area as like kids raised in a foreign country. Parents unable to parent or protect their children, prevented from helping them when they're sick, unable to intervene to stop abuse, not even allowed to decide what they can do when they're home on vacation. And children are experiencing alienation that is leading to deep psychological and emotional harm. Recently, we received an account from a former student that speaks to the extent of both routine abuse and extreme violence that children in the schools face. A monk until his parents were forced to send him to boarding school, he describes how difficult it was to be away from home, especially in grade 1 and 2, constantly missing his parents, home, and having to be responsible for everything on his own. He said, quote, "When it came to bullying and punishment, the environment was quite severe. Injuries such as broken hands, fractured fingers, bruised backs were common. Over time, students began to normalize this treatment and rarely told their parents. It was so widespread that no single incident stands out. There are simply too many," end quote. Eventually, this child and several others tried to escape from the boarding school and return to the monastery, but they were caught by police, taken to a police station, beaten, tortured with an electric device before being returned to the boarding school. Our report highlights many other cases of abuse, including children being beaten for wearing Buddhist protection cords around their necks, for saying prayers, children becoming deaf after being hit too many times on their ears and their heads. And we've documented multiple cases of suicide, attempted suicide, and death because of abuse and neglect. The Canadian former UN Special Rapporteur for Minority Rights called this system of schooling an existential threat for Tibetans and said that he is not afraid to use the word cultural genocide. He said this, I quote, "I want to emphasize this is a massive in scale, but massive in terms of the grave violations of the human rights of children and their families and the individuals involved to a scale which is actually almost inconceivable. Canada should investigate sanction and put visa restrictions on Chinese officials who are designing or implementing these policies that are intended to erase Tibetan identity, and also on the authorities at the schools where physical abuse and negligence is known to be taking place. And with China's upcoming review by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, Canada needs to work with like-minded governments to increase pressure on Beijing to abolish the colonial boarding schools system and to guarantee access to culturally and linguistically appropriate education for Tibetan children while they live at home. Thank you.
Thank you. Very well respected. And now I would like to invite Mr. Gyalo to take the floor for 2 minutes, please.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. Today I plan to do a follow-up testimony about what is happening to Tibetan children through China's colonial boarding school in Tibet. In 2016, my family children, my 2 grandnieces, being sent to the colonial boarding preschool. After 3 months, they both became a stranger at home. Let me share my personal experience with those 2 grandnieces. 1 year before, when I was visiting my home, those 2 kids jumped on me without hesitation. But in 2016 November, late November, just after 3 months, my brother asked me to come home to check what kind of a change that caused my 2 grandnieces. And then I went to school gate to pick up them. The first time they gave me eye contact, then no more emotional exchange. When I took them to home, they did not exchange any emotion with their grandparents, parents. During the dinner time, they're being silent and kept distance with our family member. It seems that they are not already lost the ability of merging the conversation with their family members. At the same time, they seem uncomfortable, start to feel uncomfortable to share the same identity with their parents or family members. That's where I see the serious change. One is the lost language means the cultural genocide start with them from home. And the second part is the racial genocide. I can see it's not the physical, but the cultural. They start rejecting or hesitating to share the common identity with family members. So that after 10 years, those kids who been in the boarding preschool in Tibet, they start criticizing their family member who are not able to speaking Chinese Mandarin. That's the serious shift. It's a generation because those boarding school policies are implemented across Tibet as a part of compulsory education.
Is it possible to wrap it out, please, because we exceed the time? Go a few seconds.
And then since last year, the school asks preschooler to spy on their parent, who emphasize the mother tongue when they come home from boarding school. And then kids report to the school communicate with the local government puts the political pressure on their parent. That's how they circulate the pressure, by cutting off the language from the home between the children and their parents.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And now I would like to invite Mrs. Tenzin Choakwai to take the floor for 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you to the committee for your renewed attention on Tibet. 3 years ago at this committee, at this hearing, I described the suppression of Tibetan language worsening since 2021, the ban on informal Tibetan language classes and closure of Tibetan-led schools, the replacement of Tibetan textbooks with Chinese, detention of teachers and students, and promotion of Putonghua or standardized Mandarin Chinese in preschool kindergartens. Today, the situation has deteriorated significantly into accelerated legalized assimilation to create China's Tibetans in a Chinese nation or Zhonghua Minzu. As of March this year, those pre-existing practices are protected under the law on promoting ethnic unity and progress. Since the last hearing, one of the most alarming precedents was the ban on even optional Tibetan language classes. In Kanzi Prefecture, a secret notification issued in September 2023 banned Tibetan language classes in all middle to high secondary schools. Teachers and students were warned that sharing this information would result in punishment. This systemic erasure of language or linguicide now extends to universities. Refugees reported to us at Tibet Watch that from 2023 onwards, plans were underway to abolish the separate status of Tibetan studies departments in several universities. The plan is to merge 5 ethnic groups, Han, Yi, Tibetan, Uyghurs, and Mongolians, in a single department, with all instruction conducted in Chinese and students required to sit for exams and submit their thesis in Chinese. A refugee told us, both teachers and students must prepare for it. Another said, now it's over. All exams and final thesis must now be written in Chinese, leaving no space whatsoever for Tibetan language. A third refugee told us that in late 2020, in Zorge County, nearly 80 young monks were locked up for 2 months in an empty classroom for thought transformation, with no teaching or family contact. After that ordeal, many quit being monks. Some of them told that refugee it was impossible to stay a monk. In some areas of Tibet, children are barred from even entering religious institutions. Those who can are children recognized as tulku or reincarnation of Tibetan Buddhist leaders, but they are also groomed with party ideology and education in the Chinese language for political indoctrination. Some children have suffered more and are also the strongest. Children of jailed protesters, of those who burned alive in self-immolation protests, of displaced farmers and nomads, children witnesses to police killings, and a 7-year-old boy that we interviewed who was slapped, beaten, and jailed for over 7 months from trying to escape to India. Those are children whose innocence, whose need for love and compassion was robbed by the Chinese state after the 2008 Tibetan uprising in Tibet. We cannot forget their childhood, even if they are now adults. The Tibet they have seen forcibly transformed leaves no space for their memory, not even for the language their names belong to. In 2024, after one of the last remaining Tibetan-led schools was forcibly shut on graduation day, the school founder urged against despair and advised to pray for better fortune for education in the next life. Impermanence is indeed impermanence, Geshe Jigme Gelsenla wrote online and requested everyone to continue shouldering their own responsibilities. That a school founder's final words offered rebirth as the only path forward tells us what has been made lost in this lifetime for an entire generation in Tibet. In July this year, the ethnic unity law takes effect, but Canada can take action against it. This committee can honor Tibetan language against China's linguicide in its education system. I urge all members of this committee to support a motion honoring April 30th as Tibetan Language Day. Government recognition now carries urgent significance for the Tibetan written language that unites Tibetans as a distinct people. It was originally initiated in Tibet in 2017 as Tibetan Calligraphy Day, a day chosen to reflect the 4 vowels and 30 letters in Tibetan. For the Tibetan refugee community here in Canada, they call Canada also their second home. Recognizing Tibetan language affirms its value as part of Canada's cultural diversity.
Can you wrap it up, please? Time is out. Wrap it, few seconds.
By honoring this day, Canada would stand with strength and dignity alongside the Tibetan people, even after over 7 decades of Chinese colonization. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I would like to invite Mrs. Chemi Lamu to take the floor for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Picture a 6-year-old, a child in grade 1 or maybe even in kindergarten. Now imagine that very young child living in a boarding school, going through a shockingly rigorous 12-hour schedule, day after day, separated from their parents and family, having to study in a completely foreign language and often facing extreme abuse. This 6-year-old may get to go home on the weekends, but cannot go to any houses of worship nor speak their own language, their own mother tongue, even to their parents. Any engagement in religious practice is not allowed, and when they return to school, they're asked to tell the teachers if the parents are breaking the rules. This is the reality of a 6-year-old child inside Tibet. Tibetan parents have no choice but to send their children to these residential boarding schools. If they refuse, they will be harassed, threatened, and face imprisonment. Now to the reality here in Canada. The Chinese government has passed a law that openly declares a war on anyone who is not Chinese and tries to maintain their distinct identity. At the same time, the Chinese government has stolen approximately 1 million Tibetan children from their families and placed them in these boarding schools where they're facing severe political indoctrination, physical and psychological abuse and neglect. And yet, the government of Canada has backseated the issue of human rights in the recent dealings with the PRC. Namely, the Prime Minister's visit to China and the Chinese Foreign Minister's subsequent visit to Canada. It has to be said that this strategy seems short-sighted and flawed. It's not megaphone diplomacy that we're seeking. It's really a reality check of Xi Jinping's predominant interest, which is really to consolidate and expand control at all costs, not a trustworthy trading partner for Canada. Michael Kovrig explains this quite well in his Foreign Affairs article. By subordinating security and human rights to immediate commercial gain, these governments, Canada and our allies, are exposing their citizens to foreign interference, arbitrary detention, and transnational repression with diminishing prospects for recourse. This subordination has very real consequences here in Canada for us. Whether it is the experiences of attacks such as death threats and rape threats that I received when I was running for student leadership at the University of Toronto Scarborough campus, or threats to dissidents like Dr. Jello, who probably represents the single greatest threat to the CCP and its hidden policies of erasure that are only now coming to light. Tibetans know all too well when we are dealing with the Chinese government, the road of accommodation only leads to further accommodations, further concessions that will be detrimental to our Canadian economy, our own citizens, and our institutions, and the most vulnerable and marginalized people who are suffering under the Xi Jinping's rule. Despite that, Tibetans inside of Tibet have defied all odds in their fight to protect all that they hold dear, especially our language, culture, and Buddhist traditions. They face the real and devastating consequences for their resistance, and yet they do not stop. All they need from us is our moral courage and support in action, now more than ever. I truly do believe in Canada, who has, one, the responsibility, but two, also the opportunity to pursue a principled, realistic foreign policy approach to China that really balances the economic and national security while upholding our own core values. This begins by drawing a red line. Red line when it comes to the abuse and incarceration of children in a residential school system designed to erase their language, culture, and identity, far too similar to our own Canadian shameful residential school system. The colonial boarding school system inside Tibet must be stopped. And I really ask this committee, Foreign Minister Anand, the Prime Minister Connie, to use every available parliamentary and foreign policy mechanism available to condemn and oppose these schools. This could begin with Prime Minister ensuring that China's colonial boarding schools and the new ethnic erasure law are condemned in the upcoming G7 leaders' statement in this month, right? And ensuring that Canada is on record with either a report, press release, or statement from this very committee ahead of the China's Rights of the Child review at the UN, calling for the colonial boarding schools to be abolished and for Tibetan children to be able to go to school in their own language and live in their own homes. Or else China won't stop. That 6-year-old child I described earlier, who was forced to sing the Chinese nursery rhymes and then cries themselves to sleep, and very
Can you
softly.
wrap it out, please? Time is up.
And they cry themselves softly to sleep because they're afraid that someone will hear. The children that miss their parents and have no one to explain them the meaning of their own name, where they were born, or who they are as Tibetan, they're counting on your action. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank for all your introduction. And now we will go to the round of question and answers. And I would like to start by inviting Madame Mrs. Crones to take the floor for 7 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair.
And those who have joined us virtually for sharing your experiences, which have been incredibly traumatizing. I just want to make sure that the people that are watching this here at home understand what we are dealing with. Ms. Lamo, are these schools optional?
No.
And what are the ages? At what age does the school start at?
So thanks to Tibet Action's work and the report that they have done, the first report reported that it was ages from 6 to 18 onwards. And then the new report, which Dr. Jello has been instrumental in exposing the hidden policies, children are as young as 4 and 5-year-olds. And these are hidden from the international community.
And Dr. Loh, based on your research, what is the goal of the school? What are the goals of these schools? And let me be very specific. Will there be any Tibetans if these schools are successful?
It's clear. With my almost nearly 30 years experience with the Tibetan education inside Tibet, they wanted to completely erase the culture and the language capacity that possibly empower the Tibetan people who resist in the future with the Chinese rule.
And what will be the identity of a graduate of the of these schools be? Will it be Tibetan or will it be Chinese?
China carry out 3 types of boarding school inside Tibet. The previous one, boarding school, is almost for 47 years. And the result of that type of school, they turned our young generation fit neither Tibetan society nor Chinese society. They are situated now as a cheap labor who are working in many Chinese cities now. And the second type of boarding school we haven't reported yet. The third type of a boarding school is way serious, dangerous, which is the colonial boarding preschool. They kept age 4 to 6 kids in the boarding. That's completely, as I mentioned previous, psychologically removed or rebuilding the Chinese culture-based psychological foundation. The psychologists already did the research. Their finding is the age 4 to 6 is the key period of the informing the psychological foundation. That Chinese intentionally targeted age 4 to 6 kids. They put them into the boarding preschool. That's very clear.
Is the intention that when these children grow up, they will no longer identify as Tibetan?
Yes.
So there will be no Tibet. If these schools are successful, if China is successful with these schools, will there be a Tibet?
As I mentioned, in the future, if we let them continue this policy, then within the 15 or 20 years, those kids who've been in the colonial boarding preschool, who socialized, then they won't be able to practice the language and culture. Mm-hmm. Even worse situation going to be they don't want to practice it, language and the culture. That is a clear indication that there's no Tibetan identity with them.
And Ms. Tathong, will there be a Tibet at the end of this journey?
There will be. It will be in spite of the Chinese authorities, but it will be one that, the foundational Buddhist culture, the mindset of Tibetans is one that I think you understand as, embodied in the Dalai Lama and Buddhism, nonviolence, compassion, this inner work, meditation, mindfulness, all these incredible discoveries now coming from Tibetan culture. These kids won't have that foundation. They'll still be Tibetan, though. And in the end, I think they won't have those features. They will have command of Chinese language and culture to some degree, but no matter what, in China, you're still an outsider. All these people who aren't Han, they're absolutely outsiders. And so what will happen, I think the future we're looking at is one where these Tibetans and Uyghurs and Southern Mongolians and you name it, they're going to have an intense national idea of like nationalism as a blueprint from the Chinese state. They won't be accepted into mainstream Chinese society. They will have to search for their Tibetan identity, and there will probably be an intense amount of resistance in the not too distant future. Tibet, as we know it, faces damage not beyond repair. I absolutely do not believe that. Tibetans are strong. People are strong.
My question was about China's goals.
Yeah.
What does China want to do with these folks?
Ultimately, with Tibetans and with everyone is to eliminate Tibetan identity, to eliminate the Uyghur problem, to eliminate the Southern Mongolian problem, so that there is nothing left. It is genocide.
And to what degree are these children now being indoctrinated, being made to deny their identity, deny their history, and then what is the forced labor situation, and are those materials are the things that produced finding their way to places like Canada, and what can we do about it?
So just to the schools question, the political indoctrination is intense, even for the youngest children. And beyond that, I think the life for the kids in the schools is to the point that, children, we've had so many people describe this to us, the schools are more like a prison than they are. It's not about education. It is about indoctrination. And for all the border regions of China, or the People's Republic of China, this is a threat for the rest of the world. This is a geostrategic question as well. This is not just about Tibetan culture and language, though, of course, that's core importance to us.
That's what I'm trying to get at.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to quickly add on to that. You know,
A few seconds, please. Time is on.
sure. Well, one, when your children are being taken away, you're as a young parent, they're facing depression. And we've seen cases. Parents are even moving towards the school to be able to get to see their children. Mind you, when there's forced labor added to this, what are the parents supposed to do to be able to make a living? Then they're being shipped off to places where we haven't even started tracking the numbers. And so I hope that we get to come back to tell you about the reality of that as well.
I'd like to invite Mr. Zubair to take the floor for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Président français. Et merci à tous les témoins d'être ici.
And thank you to all witnesses for being here today.
Ms. Yayatso, and it showed children in uniform, very young children in uniform and mock weapons. And Ms. Tetong, you also reminded us about Tibetan values of nonviolence and compassion. How do you? This is such an affront. This photo of such young children. It could be in any society, but how is this? What message is being sent through this type of imagery, and why is it going out there? Is it deliberate to intimidate the Tibetan people? What do you take out of this?
Sorry, I would like to remind all of the witness that to show photo is not allowed in the subcommittee. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's state power, and it's a show of force for Tibetans, even with these tiny children. But it's a show for the world, really. I mean, I think fundamentally, and this is the message that I feel like the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, they show us who they are time and time again, and we should believe them when they are training these tiny little children to think in this hyper-nationalistic way, hyper-violent way. Some of the curriculum materials we've seen, and we haven't seen many because it's so tightly controlled, show just unbelievable hatred targeting certain populations, including, Japan. So, they're showing us who they are in the way that they treat these youngest, most vulnerable members of society. And these are the ways that we are not the same, in terms of our government, our society, our open and free society, and the Chinese Communist Party ruling the PRC.
So I often think of, the advocacy that happens in the West and how it's clear it focuses on individual liberties, individual freedoms, and how that contrasts with the government of China's approach, which is much more collective. How do we plead our case in a way that can convince the Chinese government and deciders to respect the freedoms and wills of people, and showing that it's not an affront to the collective that the Chinese government cares so much about? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, I think we should be reminded that the Chinese government has to comply with international law because it continues to be a player in the international community. If you do not want to play in the playground of democracies and free societies, then you can step out. But China has consistently blurred the lines when it comes to being able to play, but also determine that they want to play their own rules in the international community. And we've seen this time and time again in the United Nations. Right now, as we mentioned in the recommendations, China is actually a signatory of the Child Rights Committee as well. And so they're due for a review. And here is an opportunity, perfect opportunity for them to, this is not us entering China and talking about their internal matters. We're talking about occupied nations like Tibet and talking about the rights of a child. We're talking about preventing a genocide from happening. And this Canadian government has already recognized the genocide against Uyghur people. We have known that the situation of the Uyghurs and the Tibetans are very similar. And so if that's the case, we actually, not even as Canadians, as humans and a part of this global society, we have a responsibility to ensure that that is being prevented.
And you raise a very important point about the rights of the child and how China is a signatory and part of the international community and therefore must be respecting. Just like if anybody would like to add to my question, feel free, else then I'll continue on. But
Oh, okay. You can go ahead. I'll translate if that's okay.
If we could just pause the time for a moment while they're translating, is that possible?
Thank you for your question. In terms of the individual argument between individual and the collective, the China intentionally making no future for us a collective of Tibet, but at the same time they selectively providing good condition who can follow them. This is not a national interest of Tibet. It's about try to fall apart from Tibet. Several individuals, they are following them. Of course, I'm not denying this. But also concerning the collective future of Tibet, the majority of people, they hoping, they are striving for the future of Tibet, not for a few individuals' future. For example, in the monastery, the Chinese government offering the certificate for a Lama. I call it, from the sociological term, it's called monastic agent. Once anyone Lama who accepted the Chinese government's certificate of the Lama, they lose the people's support on the ground. Lama who rejected the Chinese government's certificate of the Lama, they gain the support from the ground. That's a struggle. It's already dividing monastery. This monastery is, I call this a multifunctional institution in Tibetan society. They divided those. It's a live example. I can see it. Our people on the ground still wanted to maintain the future, the Tibetan future, not the assimilated future. Yeah.
If I could add, it's who is the collective that we're referring to, right? And who does the collective include? And it's only one Chinese supremacy identity above anyone and everyone. And that's the collective that they supposedly represent. And then also, what is the impact and the influence would be all of Asia if we were to talk about it in a global perspective.
And the Chinese people themselves, I mean, we've seen it time and time again, most recently in the White Paper Revolution and after the COVID lockdown, the zero COVID measures. The Chinese people themselves, citizens, if you follow at all what is happening, what people are saying, this idea that the Chinese government has the collective best interests of the wider society at heart. I mean, I think what you see now, and it's difficult to get the information out of China in any way because, of course, they shut it down right away. But more and more what we hear is that people can see very much that the government is so focused on all the outward-facing things. They're not taking care of the people themselves.
Certainly,
and
I would
unrest.
argue that the responsibility of every government is to make sure that their people are the well-being of one's people. That includes Tibetan people and every other minority that you mentioned.
Right.
And if there are psychological effects of these forced residential schools, then that is not taken care of. Psychological and also physical impacts leading to potentially suicide. That's not taking care of the well-being of one's citizens and one's countrymen.
Absolutely
so it's
not.
counterproductive.
Thank you, Mr. Zubairi. Thanks. I would like to invite Mr. Alexis Brunel-Dizab to take the floor for 7 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today with us for this important study. Dr. Low, in your opinion, what are the new observations that were made in the report of 2025, and what did the research of 2021 show? What is the main difference that we can observe between these two reports?
The major difference between the first report and the second report is the first report we be able to expose the boarding school as a colonial school that we defined. This is having the great impact on the Tibetan civilization. The second report, we had to be able to take it inside of the school, or the boarding school, what's happening, as my colleague Ladonla mentioned. The curriculum it's extremely exclude the Tibetan culture and the language. And at the same time, they cut off the two levels of the knowledge system from the Tibetan side to the student. In the curriculum, in the textbook, it mentioned the hitrics as a subject, the content. There's no part that's consistent with the Tibetan's philosophy of education. As a Tibetan, we emphasize the combination of the wisdom and the compassion. That's the fundamental approach of Tibetan education. What's happening in the school, they educating, the nurturing our children have a hatred. For example, in the preschool reading material, we can see clearly there's a Chinese soldier fighting a Japanese soldier. It's nurturing them as quite a hatred, and not a compassion. There's no compassion, and the concept of compassion in the classroom. There is no wisdom part of the compassion, the wisdom in the classroom. It's all about the patriotic with the Chinese CCP, the Chinese culture, and also anti-religious.
Et je pense qu'il y a un élément peut-être.
And I think that there's an element that we didn't talk a lot about today, but the element of the language. Language builds thought. So if a child loses their language, they will absolutely lose their identity, and the Tibetan way of thinking comes from Tibetan language, and we have seen it here in Canada, where French was banned in some schools in Ontario and Manitoba. We saw a quick assimilation of Francophone peoples in those provinces. Isn't that exactly the same thing that you're sharing with us here? And I don't know, how can Canada not see that clearly?
I think the language itself has the way to inform the way of the thinking. If you lose the language, then you're going to lose the way of the thinking. The way of the thinking that produce the culture and the knowledge system, that we can clearly see where the China completely shifting the derailing the civilization of the part. We can see it. Yeah.
Madame Lameau, vous avez parlé de la nouvelle.
Ms. Lameau, you talked about the new vision of the Carney government in its relationship with China for some time now. Canada, that has a history with boarding schools that banned in some provinces the learning of French in some schools. Canada, that officially recognized with a motion that I authored as well the special status of Tibetan peoples. And now what Canada is doing, in spite of these reports and in spite of everything that we can see coming from your teams, among others, in spite of this, we see a diplomatic and commercial rapprochement. So how can we explain this paradox, knowing the history of Canada, and how can we explain this, knowing the history of Canada with respect to human rights?
I want to re-emphasize that we live in a very complex world, and as a Tibetan Buddhist, we were often told about dependency, and how everything comes from millions of causes and conditions. Even this moment that we get to share with you comes together because we were able to make our flight, because you all went to vote, and so forth. And so similarly, I think that right now the condition that we see and the steps that we see the Canadian government taking, it really is a warning that we're trying to give you, right? That we know China really well. And time again, they have failed to deliver any of the promises when it comes to human rights and improving their situation. And we saw that in 2008 when they wanted the Beijing Olympics. And the world turned a blind eye when they wanted to join the World Trade Organization. And I want to emphasize that we are very appreciative of Canada's leadership when it comes to this specific committee, right? You folks, in 3 years ago when we came, you delivered a report and we saw your recommendations, which were echoing the United Nations recommendations. And that, again, was encouraging for us to continue to fight for and also continue to find the truth about the abuse and the neglect inside of these schools. That actually led to us finding out about the 4- and 5-year-olds. Because when we first came here in the 2023, it was 6- and 18-year-olds, right? And so time and time again, I think that you folks have both the responsibility and an opportunity to act, and it is disappointing to see the direction that the Canadian government is heading, but it is not too late. There is so much time for us to recourse and take the right direction, which is balanced with our priorities, our national security, and a right values alignment with the Canadian government. Thank you.
Merci. J'ai encore du temps, Monsieur.
Do I have more time, Chair? 15 minutes? I'm kidding. Okay, 15 seconds is not enough. I'll come back. Thank you. Now I invite Ms. Vandelbert for the floor. 5 minutes.
Very much, Mr. Chair. And I know that you have testified here before. 3 years ago, I was here. And it is actually heartbreaking that 3 years later, not only are you reporting that this is still continuing, but that it is getting worse. And I certainly hope that by having this hearing, we might be able to make some difference. My first question is to Tenzin Chuki. You mentioned very briefly in your opening remarks that there was an additional change since the last time where they're using the legal system. Could you maybe elaborate on the kinds of laws that have been passed since you were here last?
Yes. The key legal change is what was announced in March this year, which my co-panelist emphasized, ethnic unity law. This will take effect in July this year. The ethnic unity law encapsulates everything, all the assimilationist policies that have been underway for many decades, especially in the last 2 decades. This ethnic unity law, the members of European Parliament have already passed a resolution in April this year. They have called the Chinese government to repeal the law. They have also warned of the severe consequences on EU-China relations if this law takes into effect. They have also called the member states of the European Union to suspend their extradition treaties with China, as well as called on the European Council to impose sanctions on the Chinese officials responsible for this ethnic unity law. In Tibet, even before this law has now been codified, the Chinese government used Tibetan staple food, tsampa, barley flour, which Tibetans identify with as being distinctive to Tibet, barley flour that grows on the high altitude in Tibet. The Chinese government used tsampa as an example to say that, like all ethnic minorities integrating and becoming united, Tibetans too should be rounded up like a round barley flour, molded together. This is the level of horrific disrespect that the Chinese government has displayed with signboards in the capital city of Lhasa in Tibet, using the staple food we identify ourselves with since our ancestors to say that we are all one nationality. And now this has been codified into ethnic unity law. There have been one major change, especially in kindergarten, that is a pilot program in Nakchu, in so-called Tibet Autonomous Region. The Chinese government has put into place a pilot program of deploying 13 veterans in kindergartens. These veterans, and it also includes so it's kindergartens as well. These veterans are reported in Chinese state media for teaching discipline and motivation and air drills if there is an earthquake or natural disasters like that. But what this pilot program is hiding underneath is showing to young children that veterans are their examples. And even beyond this new pilot program, children from preschool and everywhere in the society, and ever since the Chinese Communist Party celebrated its 100th anniversary, they are propagandizing red education. They are propagandizing national defense awareness and drills, and all of that in the Chinese language. So
Thank you.
These are major changes.
Thank you. It sounds like there's a codification and almost where it may have been subtle and hidden, it's now quite overt that the end goal really is to eliminate the different cultures. I see you nodding. I wonder, because I see that the Uyghurs and Tibetans and other minorities are all being treated really the same way in this sense. We spoke last time about the fact that you're learning, like what happens with the Tibetan children. They learn from that and then use that with other groups. I wonder if you could talk to me a little bit about how that is happening. Maybe Ms. Tetong first.
It's a few second answer, please, because we already passed the time.
I'm sorry, the question?
Just
for the next round, excuse me, Anita.
Sorry.
Probably you give Mr. Davis to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much to all the witnesses who gave presentations today. I've said this before in this committee. This was not my natural sort of interest when I became an elected member of Parliament. My background was in finance, and my party put me on this committee, and I'm really grateful to have had the opportunity to learn from my colleagues and everyone that has presented. I've learned so much from everybody around this table. And I really hope that Canadians get a chance to listen and watch the presentations that are here today. But one of the things that bothers me about this, as I have learned through this process over the last year, particularly when it comes to China, it seems that we've hit a tipping point, and we, in my view, are putting human rights and the challenges that you face, that Tibetans face, the Mongolians, the Uyghurs, we are willing to sacrifice, it seems to me now, for economic prosperity, our traditional adherence to human rights, the values that we Canadians have espoused for years, the United Nations around the world, that nations play well in the sandbox. And I'm not sure which one of you said this earlier, but you play by the rules. But we're not playing by the rules. We are now going to be allowing goods from China that have been used by slave labor, highly subsidized by China. Where do we draw the line? At what point do you stand up and say, sorry, Canada, you're not actually doing what you promised to do? And I'm going to actually ask Ms. Gyatso for a response on that, because I continually see that we're always trying, but we're willing to sacrifice for economic gain, and that bothers me. Ms. Gyatso?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your question. And I think that is one area where I think the small Tibetan exile community has been working across countries and nations. We are there are 7.5 million Tibetans inside Tibet, but outside of Tibet, we are 150,000 spread across in 27 countries. And but people get surprised to hear that, because you said they think it's such a small community plus one Dalai Lama. But what we're trying to do is build coalitions. I think when Western countries speak of their values in a coordinated fashion, then that puts China on the defensive. Otherwise, China gets very emboldened, especially in the UN status and other fields. So I think when China is up for review for child's rights, that is the time when, with the leadership of the Canadians, we can bring together many host countries to speak in one voice. Again, with the new ethnic unity and progress law that some of my other colleagues have spoken, that is a space where it'll be good to show a united front. I know the Germans are putting out, the European Parliament is, and many others are.
Okay,
so
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Thank you.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but because I have limited time, but I'm really interested to know what your recommendation is. Perhaps, Ms. Tethong, you can give me your view on what the trade-off is. To me, it's like we're trying to push rope uphill. It's an impossible task. We want to defend human rights. We want to be your advocate. We have talked a lot about transnational repression. Ms. Lamo, you've been subjected to it here in Canada. As one of my colleagues would say, is the juice worth the squeeze? Are we not doing the right thing by allowing our trade to continue to expand while turning a blind eye to human rights violations?
Yeah, I think the having done this work for 30 years, I think the thing that we are clear about from the Tibetan side is it's not either or. This idea that you could only sort of pursue the trade, or you pursue the trade, don't talk human rights, or don't pursue the trade, and then you can do all. The key is it's both and especially in this moment when the world is realigning and in this difficult position, and all the countries together are in difficult positions when it comes to trade and tariffs and whatnot. This is the time to, I believe, push for both, because China needs the world too. China's the target of these, all these economic challenges the world is facing. China's facing them too. And so there's an opportunity for like-minded nations to work together, not to give up all this ground. I think one of the things the Chinese government makes people believe is that nations believe is that you either say nothing or you say everything and then we're not going to be friends. It's just not true. And I think we must push human rights. We must push for real action. We have to hold fast to these values while engaging with China, perhaps more now than ever before, because we can see how intent this regime is, especially under Xi Jinping's rule, to change the world order.
Thank you. Half a minute over.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. Ms. Lamo, you testified here in 2023, and you mentioned then that after the publication of the 2021 report, many people asked you, why is the world not aware of this issue of the boarding schools? And how did it go almost in hiding? And do you feel the same thing in the new report, or do you feel like there is more attention paid compared with the past?
The international community was not aware, but when these were exposed, I believe that the international community continued to stay silent. And that's why the abuse and the neglect continues to worsen, and the Chinese government feels so emboldened to not only do this inside of Tibet and occupied borders, but also extend their repression here on Tibetan Canadians. And so what has changed from the international community's response, it has been positive. We've seen UN special rapporteurs, multiple of them, more than 8 of them speaking out. When Canada leads a side event at the UN, more than 17 countries are showing up to show solidarity. This is a response to the Chinese government, and we want to see that leadership continue from Canada to be able to continue to show that Canada will stand on the right grounds of history.
Et là, j'ai une question, peut-être que Dr. Lo...
I have a question that Ms. Tetong or Mr. Lo can answer, either one of you. Yes, maybe people in the international arena are more aware but stay silent, but there are everyday people who are not necessarily aware of this. And inside China, Chinese people living in Beijing, Chinese people living in Shanghai, are they aware of what is happening in Tibet? Do they have that information? That's what we ask ourselves when we look at the action of their government.
Not all of them understand. Not all of them know that the situation in Tibet, what their government done in the Tibet. The people are aware about the Tibet issue with their nationalist ID. And some of them, we shouldn't do this way. They really have. In 2017, before Xi Jinping took second term of the position, during the table, having a dinner with the Chinese scholar, some of the scholars saying, we can give the general autonomy for TR, but if you give entire Tibet as a general autonomy, it's going to be too big, right? They can talk about that kind of topic. In October of 2018, when we have together, throughout our conversation, they also can talk about, hey, Yellow, if the Dalai Lama come to Beijing, would you like to go to Beijing to pay homage to him? I say yes. If he be able to come to Beijing, that means the political issue is being solved. Why not? The 100% of the people will go there. We can talk about that kind of stuff. But other people, when you mentioned His Holiness, they just immediately politicize it. You're a separatist. Yeah, that's we think Chinese people, they are different. Yeah.
Et à quel point, parce qu'on en a parlé aussi.
And to what extent? Because we said that it's not only the issue for China and Tibet, but it goes beyond that, the region and even the world. So to what extent is what is happening in Tibet used as a lab case with what will happen with the Uyghur and other cultural minorities on the quote-unquote official territory of China? To what extent is Tibet the starting point of this, forgive my term, experiments?
Quick answer, please.
Yeah. Since 2018, Xi Jinping 2018, since Xi Jinping stabilized his second term, he made a radical change. First change is previously we promote the cultural, linguistic, ethnic diversity in China as a multi-flower garden. But from now, they say that year, end of 2018, they say, now we shift to the monolingual, monocultural, mono-ethnic country. So they clear that they start the philosophical against the cultural, linguistic, ethnic diversity. So under that framework, then China produced the multi-level of the policy on the ground regarding that framework. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Brinandi-Seb. By the name of the subcommittee chair, members, staff, interpreters, I would like to thank all our witnesses for their testimony for this meeting today. about the Tibetan children placed in an administrative school in the Republic Popular of China. Thanks for being with us, and we suspend for a couple of minutes.